I returned from a $12,000 safari only to overhear my daughter and son-in-law plotting my accidental death. They wanted my $4.5 million estate, but they didn't realize the tiger they tried to cage was already home to strike back. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The Arizona sun hit my windshield like a physical blow, 109 degrees of dry heat that turned the interior of my sedan into a furnace. I loosened my tie, the silk sticking to my neck after another 10-hour shift at the dealership, and pulled into my driveway. I was 62 years old, the owner of 3 successful dealerships, and currently a stranger in my own home. For 2 weeks, the silence in that house had been thick enough to choke on. It all started when I refused to hand over $35,000 for another one of Melvin's investment schemes. My son-in-law was a man who saw every dollar I earned as a personal challenge to his ego. When I said no, Frances looked at me like I had reached across the table and slapped her. My daughter, the girl I had coached in soccer and walked down the aisle, hadn't spoken a word to me since. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, watching the heat shimmer off the pavement. I was tired of the fighting. I was tired of being the ATM that everyone resented for having a balance. I stepped out, the air smelling of hot asphalt and dust, and walked toward the front door. I expected more of the cold shoulder, more heavy sighs and slammed cupboard doors. Instead, when I pushed inside, the air conditioning hummed a different tune. I heard voices coming from the living room, low, urgent, but not angry. I stopped in the foyer, my hands still on the brass handle. 2 weeks of ice, and now they were whispering like conspirators. I moved toward the archway, my leather shoes silent on the Persian rug. Frances and Melvin were huddled together on the couch. An envelope sat on the cushion between them, thick and white. Melvin looked up first. He didn't scowl. He didn't look away. He gave me a smile that was too wide, too fast, like a salesman closing a deal he knew was a scam. He stood up and gestured toward the couch. "Ben, we've been waiting for you," he said. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. Frances looked up too, and for the first time in months, her eyes weren't hard. She looked like the daughter I remembered, soft and full of a light I thought had gone out years ago. "Open it, Dad," she whispered. "Please, we want to make things right." I hesitated, the suspicion that had kept my business alive for 40 years screaming at me to walk away. But the look in her eyes was a hook I couldn't unsee. I stepped forward and picked up the envelope. My fingers fumbled with the flap. Inside were boarding passes, the heavy cardstock of business class, embossed with the gold logo of an international carrier. I stared at the destination printed in bold black ink. Tanzania, Kilimanjaro International Airport. My hands started to shake. This was my dream, a trip I had mentioned maybe twice in passing over the last decade. "How did you pay for this?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. $12,000 minimum for a package like this. Melvin hadn't hit a sales target at the dealership in 6 months. He complained about the price of premium gas. Melvin laughed, a sound that seemed genuine enough to settle my stomach. "I've been saving my bonuses for a year, Ben. You've earned this. You work harder than anyone I know." Frances moved then, wrapping her arms around me. She smelled like the perfume I'd bought her for Christmas, and her voice was a warm weight against my shoulder. "Just be happy, Dad. Promise us you'll just be happy." I closed my eyes and let the armor I'd worn for 30 years crumble. I believed them because I needed to. The tickets felt heavy in my hand, a physical weight of redemption. I hugged them both, feeling a sting behind my eyes I was too proud to show. "When do I leave?" I asked. 3 days, Melvin said, his smile never wavering. "Just enough time to get your affairs in order and pack a bag. 2 weeks of lions and elephants, Ben, the whole 9 yards. I looked down at the paper again, my thumb tracing the flight numbers. I didn't see the flicker in Melvin's eyes when I turned toward the stairs. I didn't hear the silence that fell over the room the second I stepped out of view. I only saw the mountain peak in my mind. The next 72 hours moved in a blur of khaki shirts and malaria pills. I stood in my closet, pulling down a suitcase I hadn't used in 8 years. I'd bought it for Frances's graduation trip to Europe, a trip I had ended up paying for twice when Melvin decided he was coming along. As I folded my pants, I found an old photo wedged in the back of a drawer. Frances at 10, wearing her soccer jersey, missing a front tooth. I traced the line of her smile, wondering when the thank yous had turned into demands. When had my daughter become someone who viewed my love as a transaction? I shook the thought away. The tickets were real. The gesture was real. Maybe this was the reset we needed. I drove myself to the airport on the third morning, the car thermometer already reading 100 degrees at 9 a.m. I checked the tickets one last time at a red light. $12,000. It nagged at me, a tiny splinter of doubt. Where did a man who failed at sales find that kind of cash? But then I thought of Frances's hug, the way she had squeezed my hand just like she did when she was a little girl. I chose to trust her. I parked in long term, hauled my bag to the shuttle, and stepped onto the plane. As the wheels left the tarmac and Phoenix shrank into a grid of brown and gray, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I was going to Africa. I was going to be free. The flight was a 20-hour haze of movies and lukewarm gin. I landed in Kilimanjaro in a daze of jet lag and excitement. The air was different here, smelling of dry grass and distant wood smoke. I moved through customs, my passport getting stamped with a satisfying thud. Joseph was waiting for me at the exit. He was a fit man in his 40s, dressed in crisp safari gear, holding a sign with my name. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were busy, scanning my face, my posture, my hands. "First things first, Mr. West," he said, his English perfect. "Your health. You have your diabetes medication? You took your dose?" I laughed, a bit taken caught off guard. "I've lived with this for 15 years, Joseph. I'm a pro." He didn't smile back. "The altitude and the heat, they change things. It is my responsibility to keep you safe. Very safe." We walked to a rugged Land Cruiser. Joseph checked his watch twice before we even left the parking lot. He seemed rushed, his movements jerky and precise. I climbed into the passenger seat, the African sun already biting at my arms. We drove for 3 hours toward the first lodge. I watched the landscape change from dusty towns to vast golden plains. I felt like a boy again, eyes glued to the window. We reached the lodge at sunset. It was a beautiful place, canvas walls glowing amber under the stars. I checked my blood sugar 118. Perfect. I sat on my small deck, listening to the grunts of hippos in a nearby river. I thought of Frances and Melvin. I felt guilty for every suspicion I'd ever had. They had given me this. They had given me the world. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the acacia trees, dreaming of lions. I didn't know that 3 miles away, Joseph was pacing outside his own quarters, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, urgent tone to a man in Phoenix. The dawn was a bruised purple when Joseph knocked on my tent pole. "Time for the lions, Mr. West." The first 4 days were magic. I saw cheetahs lounging in the shade and elephants moving like gray ghosts across the horizon. Joseph was an encyclopedia of the bush. He knew every bird, every track, every shift in the wind. But on the 5th morning, the rhythm changed. We were near a murky watering hole. Joseph pointed toward the bank. "We should walk down there," he said. "The crocodiles are active. You want the close-up shot, right?" I looked at the water. It was thick, green, and the bank was steep and slick with mud. My guidebook said stay in the vehicle near water. I mentioned it, and Joseph's face hardened. "Trust me, Ben. I do this every day. It's perfectly safe. You want the authenticity, don't you?" He was pushy, his voice losing its professional warmth. I stayed in the car. Later that day, he suggested we approach a buffalo herd on foot, the most dangerous animals in the park, and he wanted me to walk toward them with a camera. "No, Joseph," I said, my business instincts finally waking up. "We stay here." He didn't argue, but he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned gray. Something was very wrong. That night, I stepped out of my tent to catch the breeze. I heard Joseph's voice coming from behind the equipment shed. He was speaking English, his tone sharp and frustrated. "He's too careful," Joseph said into the phone. "It's not working naturally. I can't just push him in with other tourists around." "No, he won't take the bait." I froze, the hair on my arm standing up. He was talking about me. He was talking about me like I was a problem to be solved, a task he couldn't finish. My heart hammered against my ribs. I retreated into the shadows, my mind racing. Who was on the other end of that line? I didn't sleep. Every rustle of the canvas sounded like a footstep. On the 8th morning, I woke up shaking. My vision was blurred, a dark fog creeping into the corners of my eyes. I fumbled for my meter. 310. Dangerously high. I had missed my evening dose, too distracted by the phone call I'd overheard. I told Joseph I was done. I needed to get back to the city, to a doctor I knew. His face drained of color. "No, Mr. West, you can't leave. We have a doctor at the main camp. You paid for 2 weeks. You must stay." He was panicking, his eyes darting toward the horizon. "I'm going home, Joseph, now." He tried to stall. He suggested one last drive, a shorter route, a visit to a local village. I ignored him. I called the airline from the lodge office and moved my flight up. Joseph watched me pack with a look of pure desperation, like a man who knew he was about to lose his own life. I didn't understand why, but I knew I had to run. I made it to the airport by sunset. As the plane lifted off, I watched Tanzania vanish into the clouds. It was beautiful, but it felt like a tomb I had just barely climbed out of. I sat in my seat for 20 hours, staring at the back of the headrest, a cold realization beginning to bloom in my gut. I landed in Phoenix at midnight. The 85-degree night air felt like a homecoming and a warning. I didn't call a taxi to take me to the house. I checked into a Hilton downtown. I spent the next 2 days in a hotel room service trays stacking up, my laptop open. I pulled my bank records. I looked at the dealership's accounts. I found it on the 3rd hour of searching. A wire transfer from the dealership's reserve fund, authorized by Melvin using a digital signature that looked suspiciously like a copy of mine. $12,000. He hadn't saved for a year. He had stolen my own money to send me to a guide who was trying to kill me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the hum of the hotel air conditioning the only sound in the room. My own daughter, my own son-in-law. They didn't want me to have a vacation. They wanted me to have an accident. They wanted the house, the dealerships, the millions in the bank, and they didn't want to wait 20 years for nature to take its course. I felt a hollowed-out coldness in my chest. The man who had coached the soccer team was dead. The man who had paid for the wedding was gone. I picked up the phone and called Rick Holloway, the meanest estate lawyer in the state of Arizona. Holloway's office was on the 14th floor, all glass and expensive leather. I told him everything. The tickets, the buffalo, the phone call, the wire transfer. He didn't blink. He just took notes with a fountain pen that scratched against the paper like a claw. "You have no proof of the murder plot, Ben," he said. "An overheard conversation is hearsay. But the wire transfer? That's theft. And the house? That's yours. The will? We can change that in 10 minutes. I looked out the window at the mountains. "Do it," I said. "Change it all. Leave her $1, just enough so she can't contest it." I signed the papers at 4:30 p.m. 3 copies, each signature feeling like a nail in a coffin. Frances was no longer my heir. She was a line item I was deleting from the ledger of my life. Holloway shook my hand. "Don't tell them you're back yet," he warned. "Let them think they won. Watch what they do when the tiger thinks the cage is empty." I nodded. I went back to the hotel and sent a text to Frances. "Flight delayed. Arriving tomorrow night around 10 CRY. Love, Dad." Her reply came in seconds. "We miss you so much. Can't wait to hear about the trip." I stood in the driveway at 10:15 the next night. I'd taken an Uber, leaving my suitcase in the trunk for a moment. Every light in the house was on. They were celebrating. I could see the glow of the TV, hear the faint sound of music. I used my key, the lock turning with a familiar click. I walked in, and the world stopped. Frances and Melvin were in the kitchen, a bottle of champagne open on the counter. They looked at me and I saw it. Not relief, not joy. I saw the absolute naked terror of people who were looking at a ghost. The champagne flute in Melvin's hand didn't just shake, it tilted, spilling expensive bubbles over his knuckles and onto the tile. Frances made a sound in the back of her throat, a choked-off gasp that died before it hit the air. Her face went the color of a fish belly, gray and translucent under the kitchen lights. I stood there, my travel-worn jacket still over my arm, and smiled. It was the smile I used when a competitor thought they had me cornered on a land deal. "Dad," Frances finally whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy. We thought the flight was delayed. We thought you were still in Addis." "The safari was incredible," I said, walking toward them with slow, measured steps. But my sugar acted up. I decided to come home early. Surprising, isn't it? I watched Melvin's eyes. They were darting toward his phone on the counter, probably wondering why Joseph hadn't called to tell him the job was done. I walked right past them to the fridge and poured myself a glass of cold water. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," I said, taking a long sip. "Is everything okay?" Melvin found his voice, though it sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "Yeah, Ben, of course. Just a shock. We were so worried about you." He reached for a towel to wipe the champagne, but his hands were trembling so hard he missed the spill twice. Frances rushed forward then, her theatrical instincts kicking in. She tried to wrap her arms around me, but I stepped back, adjusting my watch. "I'm exhausted, honey. 30 hours of travel. I think I'll just head up to bed. We can talk about the trip in the morning. I want to tell you all about the crocodiles." I saw her flinch at the word. I didn't wait for a response. I hauled my suitcase up the stairs, feeling their eyes boring into my shoulder blades like twin lasers. I got into my room and locked the door. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. 10 minutes later, the whispering started. It was a frantic, low hissing coming from the hallway. I heard the word Joseph. I heard the word money. Then, Frances's voice, sharp with panic. "He knows something, Melvin. Look at his eyes. He's never looked at me like that." I slept with one eye open, the weight of the new will in my briefcase acting as a pillow. At 5:30 a.m., I was up. I dressed in my best charcoal suit, the one I wore for board meetings and funerals. I skipped breakfast. I drove to my flagship dealership, the one where Melvin had been coasting for 8 years on my dime. I sat in my glass-walled office and watched the sun rise over the rows of shining cars. At 9 sharp, I called my floor manager. "Send Melvin to my office the second he walks in," I said. "And tell security to stand by the door." Melvin walked in at 9:15, looking like he'd spent the night in a blender. He tried for a grin, but it looked like a scar. "Hey, Ben, ready to hear about the sales figures?" I didn't point to the chair. I stood up, leaning my weight on my desk. "Melvin, you're fired," I said. "Effective 30 seconds ago. Your sales are 40% below target for the 6th month running. I've documented 4 customer complaints you ignored. You have 1 hour to clear your cubicle. Security will escort you to the edge of the property." He froze, his mouth hanging open like a landed carp. "You can't do that," he stammered. "I'm family. Frances will—" "The dealership is a business, Melvin, not a welfare program," I interrupted. "And as for family, I think we both know where we stand." I reached into my drawer and pulled out the wire transfer record. $12,000 from the reserve fund, authorized by you. That's grand theft, Melvin. I should be calling the police. Instead, I'm giving you an hour. If you're still on the lot at 10:15, the handcuffs come out. His face went from white to a sickly purple. He turned and ran out of the office, nearly knocking over a water cooler. I watched through the glass as 2 guards walked him to his desk. The entire sales floor stopped. People I had employed for 20 years watched in total silence as the owner's son-in-law stuffed a stapler and a framed photo into a cardboard box. It was the walk of shame, a public execution of his ego. He was led through the glass double doors and out into the 100-degree heat. He didn't have a car. I had authorized the dealership to take back the Lexus he'd been driving since it was titled to the company. He stood on the sidewalk with his box looking like a beggar. I wasn't done. At 1 p.m., I had a courier deliver a certified letter to my own house. Frances would be the one to sign for it. The letter was brief. It informed them that the house was being placed on the market in 30 days. As the owner of the property, I was terminating their residency. They were guests who had overstayed their welcome. I arrived home at 6 p.m. to find the living room in ruins. Francis was screaming at Melvin. Melvin was throwing a whiskey glass against the fireplace. They both turned to me like I was the devil himself. "What is this?" Francis shrieked, waving the letter. "You're throwing us out? Your own daughter on the street?" I sat down in my leather armchair and crossed my legs. "I gave you 8 years of rent-free living, Francis. I gave your husband a job he couldn't do and a salary he didn't earn. I paid for your wedding, your cars, your clothes. And in return, you sent me to Tanzania to be eaten by crocodiles so you could get your hands on my bank account a few years early." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" The air left the room. Frances fell back onto the sofa, her hand over her mouth. Melvin tried to step toward me, his face twisted in a desperate, ugly mask. "You can't prove that. You're just an old man losing his mind." "I don't need to prove it to a jury, Melvin," I said. "I just needed to prove it to myself. I've already changed the will. Everything goes to a foundation for victims of elder abuse. You get $1, Francis. Use it to buy a candy bar. You have 30 days to find a life, because as of right now, mine is closed to you." Francis started to sob, the ugly, snotty kind of crying that usually made me fold. But I felt nothing. It was like watching a movie in a language I didn't speak anymore. I stood up and walked to the stairs. "I'll be in my room," I said. "If I hear either of your voices, I'm calling the sheriff to trespass you tonight." I went upstairs and closed the door. I heard them whispering again, but the panic had turned into blame. "It's your fault," Francis hissed. "You were supposed to handle the guide." Melvin's reply was a muffled curse. I realized then that they didn't even love each other. They were just two scavengers fighting over a carcass that wasn't dead yet. The next week was a slow-motion car crash. They couldn't afford a lawyer because I had frozen the credit cards they were authorized on. They couldn't get a loan because Melvin had no job and a history of bad debt. I watched them pack. I watched them carry boxes of designer clothes I'd paid for out to a U-Haul they'd had to beg Melvin's brother to rent. Every time I walked through the kitchen, they scuttled away like roaches. On the last night, Frances knocked on my door. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. "Dad, please, just tell me how we can fix this." I looked at her, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to bring me dandelions. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, a memory of a heart that used to beat for her. "You fix it by living, Frances," I said. "Go find out who you are when there isn't a millionaire holding your hand. Maybe in 10 years we can have a cup of coffee, but not today." I closed the door in her face. I heard her walk away, her footsteps heavy and slow. The house felt bigger than it ever had. It felt clean. The next morning, the U-Haul pulled out of the driveway. I stood at the window and watched it go. Melvin didn't look back. Frances did, her face pressed against the glass for a second before the truck turned the corner. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I had a flight to book, Australia, solo. I was going to see the Great Barrier Reef, and I was going to pay for it with my own money, on my own terms. I took a deep breath, the scent of the desert air coming through the cracked window. I realized then that family isn't about blood. It's about who stays in the room when the lights go out. I had spent my life building an empire for people who wanted me buried under it. No more. I called the locksmith and had every cylinder in the house changed. I stood on my porch as the sun set, the sky turning a deep, violent orange. I was an old man, and I was alone, and for the first time in 30 years, I was at peace. I went inside, locked the door, and turned out the lights. The first thing I noticed about the house after they left was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. For 8 years, there had been a constant low hum of tension, the muffled thud of footsteps that didn't belong to me, the distant rattle of the fridge being opened for a midnight snack I hadn't authorized. Now, it was just the air conditioning and the settling of the foundation. I walked through the guest wing, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. They had left it in a mess. Scuff marks on the baseboards, a pile of trash in the corner, and a single lonely sock under the bed. It was the physical remains of a life they had treated like a hotel. I spent the next 3 days cleaning. I didn't hire a service. I wanted to feel the grime of their presence leaving my house. I scrubbed the floors until my knees ached and my hands were raw from bleach. Every time I wiped away a stain, I felt a little more of the anger dissipate. By the third night, the house smelled of lemon oil and fresh air. I sat in my study with a glass of scotch, watching the moon rise over the Scottsdale Hills. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "We can't pay the deposit on the apartment, please. It's $900. I didn't reply. I deleted the message and blocked the number. The please didn't move me. I knew what it was. A hook designed to pull me back into the role of the provider. If I gave them $900 today, it would be $2,000 for car repairs next month. I was done being the engine that pulled their train. I went back to my travel plans. Australia was still the goal, but I decided to add a stop in New Zealand. I wanted to see the mountains, the real ones, the ones that didn't come with a hidden agenda. I felt a strange bubbling energy in my chest. I was 62, and I was starting over. Monday morning, I returned to the dealership. The atmosphere was different. The staff moved with a new kind of purpose. With Melvin gone, the boss's son-in-law shadow had vanished. People weren't afraid to speak up about inventory issues or customer complaints. My floor manager, a guy named Dave, who had been with me for 15 years, walked into my office. "Ben," he said, sitting down without being asked. I didn't want to say anything while he was here, but Melvin was a cancer on this floor. He was telling the junior guys they didn't have to follow up on leads because the family owned the place. I felt a fresh wave of shame. I had allowed my love for my daughter to blind me to the fact that I was poisoning my own business. "I know, Dave," I said. "It won't happen again." We spent the morning looking at the books. Without Melvin's bonuses and the various expenses he'd been funneling through the company, our margins were already looking better. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that my own family had been a more significant threat to my legacy than any competitor. I authorized a bonus for the sales team. They had earned it. That afternoon, I got a call from the local police department. My heart skipped a beat. "Mr. West?" the officer asked. "We have a Melvin Miller in custody. He was caught trying to use a company credit card at a high-end electronics store. The card was flagged as stolen." I sat back in my chair, closing my eyes. I had forgotten to cancel that specific card, a secondary account for office supplies. Melvin, in his desperation, had tried to buy a $3,000 television, probably hoping to hawk it for cash. "Do you want to press charges?" the officer asked. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, the one of Francis at 10 years old. Then, I looked at the wire transfer record for $12,000. Melvin hadn't just stolen from me, he had tried to end me. If I let this go, he would never stop. He would keep scratching at the door until he found a way back in. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Press charges. The card was canceled and he was terminated from the company 2 weeks ago. He had no authorization." I hung up and felt a cold, sharp sense of finality. I wasn't just defending my money anymore. I was defending my right to exist without fear. An hour later, Frances called. I let it ring. She called again. And again. On the fourth time, I picked up. "Dad, you have to help him," she screamed. She was hysterical, her voice cracking into high-pitched shrieks. "He's in jail. They're saying it's a felony. You can't do this to us. He only did it because we're desperate. We have no food, Dad. No food." I looked at my watch. It was 4:30 p.m. "Francis," I said, my voice like ice. "There's a soup kitchen on 4th Street. They serve dinner at 5 now. I suggest you get in line." The silence on the other end was absolute. It was the silence of a person who had finally realized that the old rules didn't apply. The bank was closed. The vault was empty. "You're a monster," she hissed, her voice dripping with a venom I had never heard before. I wish Joseph had finished the job. I felt a jolt of electricity go through me. There it was. The mask was off. The truth was out in the open, screaming in the air between us. "Thank you for confirming that, Francis," I said. "I'll be sure to mention that to the prosecutor." I hung up and blocked her number too. I went home that night and sat in the dark. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt like a survivor. I realized that the daughter I had loved hadn't existed for a long time. She had been replaced by a creature of greed and entitlement, a person who could look at her own father and see only a stack of bills. I went to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich. I ate it in the quiet, watching the shadows of the palm trees dance on the wall. I felt a strange sense of freedom. The ties were cut. There was nothing left to hold me back. The next day, I met with Holloway again. We finalized the sale of the house. I didn't need 5 bedrooms and a pool. I wanted a condo downtown, something with security and a view of the city lights, something that was mine and mine alone. Melvin's lawyer is asking for a plea deal, Holloway said. They want you to drop the charges in exchange for a full confession of the wire transfer. I shook my head. No, let him go to trial. I want it all on the record. I want the world to see exactly what they are. I spent the weekend packing my own things. It was a cathartic process, deciding what parts of my past were worth keeping. I kept the old photos of Frances, the ones from before she met Melvin. I kept my wife's jewelry, which I planned to donate to a charity she had loved. The rest, the expensive furniture they had picked out, the guest room sets, the fine china we never used, I sent to auction. I wanted a clean slate. I wanted to move into my new life with nothing but what I could carry. On Sunday night, I stood in the empty living room. The house felt like a shell. I walked to the front door and turned out the lights. I stepped out onto the porch and locked the door for the last time. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. I was 62. I was alone, and I was finally, truly free. I got into my car and drove toward the city lights, leaving the past in the rearview mirror. Australia was waiting. The world was waiting, and for the first time, I was ready to see it. The condo was on the 20th floor, all glass and steel. It was modern, efficient, and completely anonymous. I sat on the balcony, watching the traffic flow like a river of light below me. My phone buzzed. It was an email from the prosecutor's office. The trial date is set for November 12th. We will need your testimony regarding the credit card and the wire transfer. I replied with a simple, I will be there. I felt a sense of duty, not just to myself, but to the idea of justice. They had tried to take everything. Now they would pay the price. I spent the next month preparing for my trip. I bought new gear, researched the best diving spots, and even started taking a language class. I felt like I was waking up from a long sleep. I realized that I had spent so much of my life taking care of others that I had forgotten how to take care of myself. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to find joy in the small things, a good book, a well-cooked meal, a quiet sunset. I was discovering a version of myself that I really liked. The day before I was set to leave, I went to the cemetery to visit my wife's grave. I sat on the grass and told her everything. I told her about the trip to Africa, the betrayal, and the new life I was building. I felt a sense of connection, a feeling that she would be proud of me for standing up for myself. I left a bouquet of her favorite flowers and walked back to my car, feeling a sense of closure. I was ready. I was finally ready to move on. As I checked in for my flight the next morning, I felt a surge of excitement. I was going to see the world. I was going to have adventures. I was going to live my life to the fullest. As the plane took off, I looked down at the city and felt a sense of gratitude. I had survived the storm, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. The future was bright, and I was ready to embrace it. I closed my eyes and smiled, looking forward to the journey ahead. The Great Barrier Reef was a kaleidoscope of color that made the Arizona desert feel like a black and white movie. I spent my mornings 20 feet underwater, the silence of the ocean a balm for the noise that had filled my head for years. Down there, among the coral and the clownfish, the betrayal in Phoenix felt like a story that had happened to someone else. I was no longer the man who had been sent to die. I was just another diver, a body moving through the blue. But even in the middle of paradise, the past has a way of finding the surface. I was sitting at a beachside bar in Cairns, a cold beer in my hand, when my phone pinged with a notification from the Phoenix local news app. Prominent dealership owner's son-in-law sentenced in fraud case. I clicked the link. my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. There was a mugshot of Melvin. He looked broken. His hair was thinning, his eyes were sunken, and that smug salesman's grin had been replaced by a look of hollowed-out defeat. He had taken a plea deal, 3 years in state prison for the wire transfer and the credit card fraud. But the article didn't stop there. It mentioned that his wife, Frances Miller, was being investigated for her role in the wider financial irregularities. I closed the app and stared out at the Pacific. I felt a strange lack of triumph. It was just gravity, finally catching up to people who had tried to fly on stolen wings. I stayed in Australia for 3 months. I traveled from the rainforests of the north to the rugged cliffs of the south. I met people who didn't know I owned a single car, much less 3 dealerships. I was just Ben from America, a guy who told decent stories and tipped well. I realized that my identity had been so tied up in being the provider and the boss that I hadn't known who I was without the title. I liked this version of Ben better. He was quieter, more observant. He didn't feel the need to solve everyone's problems with a checkbook. But the trial for the civil suit I'd filed, the one to officially reclaim every cent Melvin had siphoned and to finalize the eviction debt, was approaching. I had to go back. I landed at Sky Harbor in late October, the heat finally beginning to break. I took an Uber to my condo, the city lights feeling familiar but distant. Rick Holloway met me the next morning. He looked as sharp as ever, his eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. "Melvin is behind bars, but Frances is fighting the civil judgment," he said. "She's claiming undue hardship and trying to sue for a portion of the estate now, claiming you're mentally unfit." I laughed, a dry, harsh sound. "Mentally unfit? Because I won't let her rob me?" Holloway nodded. "It's a desperation move. She has no money, no home, and her husband is in a jumpsuit. She's going for the dementia angle to get the will overturned before you even die. We need you to sit for a deposition. And Ben? She's going to be there." I felt a spark of the old fire. They still thought they could play me. They still thought I was the soft touch who would fold if they pushed hard enough. "Let's do it," I said. "Tomorrow." The deposition took place in a windowless conference room that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. I sat at the head of the table, Holloway next to me. The door opened and Frances walked in. I almost didn't recognize her. She had lost weight, her face drawn and tight. She was dressed in a cheap suit that didn't fit right, her hair a mess of unwashed blonde. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the old entitlement in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by a practiced look of sorrow. She sat across from me, her lawyer, a guy who looked like he'd bought his degree at a yard sale, fiddling with a tape recorder. For 3 hours, her lawyer grilled me. He asked about my memory, my medications, the confusion I'd shown in Africa. He tried to paint my reaction to the murder plot as a paranoid delusion brought on by high blood sugar. I answered every question with a calm, surgical precision. I provided dates, times, and exact dollar amounts. I recounted the conversation I'd overheard in the kitchen word for word. I watched Frances as I spoke. She wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on a spot on the table, her fingers twisting a cheap plastic pen until it snapped. "Mr. West," her lawyer said, leaning forward, "isn't it true that you've been alienating your only child because you've become increasingly erratic and controlling in your old age?" I looked directly at Frances. "No," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "I've been alienating her because she tried to have me killed for a house she didn't build and money she didn't earn. The only thing erratic about me was how long I let her treat me like a bank." Frances looked up then, her eyes full of tears. "Dad, please," she sobbed. "I was scared. Melvin made me think we were losing everything." I didn't blink. "You were losing everything, Frances, because you weren't doing anything to keep it. You lived a life of luxury on my sweat, and when I asked for a little respect, you decided I was worth more dead than alive." I stood up, signaling the end of the session. "The mental unfitness suit is a joke, and we both know it. If you move forward with it, I'll file for malicious prosecution. I have the wire transfer records, the phone logs from Tanzania, and a mountain of debt you owe the company. Walk away now, or I will make sure you spend the next 10 years in a courtroom instead of a house." She collapsed into her chair, her lawyer looking at his shoes. They knew it was over. The dementia play was their last card, and I'd just burned the deck. I walked out of the room without looking back. Holloway caught up to me in the hallway. "That was a masterclass, Ben," he said, grinning. "She'll drop the suit by morning. She has nothing left to fight with." I nodded, but I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt a profound sense of sadness. This was the end of the line for my family. The legacy I'd worked 40 years to build was a smoking ruin. I went back to my condo and sat on the balcony. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows over the valley. I realized that for the first time in my life, I had no one to take care of. No daughter to worry about, no son-in-law to bail out, no business to micromanage. It was a terrifying kind of freedom. I picked up my phone and called my sister in Chicago. We hadn't spoken in years, our relationship strained by the same drama that had swallowed my life. "Hey, Sarah," I said when she picked up. "It's Ben. I'm thinking of coming for a visit. I'd like to see the kids." The conversation lasted an hour. It was awkward at first, but then the walls started to come down. We talked about our parents, about the old house in Illinois, about the things that actually mattered. I realized that while I'd lost a daughter, I still had a family, if I was willing to do the work to find them. I felt a sense of hope I hadn't expected. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a man who still had a lot of life left to live. I was going to be an uncle, a brother, a friend. I was going to be more than just a bank. The next morning, Holloway called. "She dropped the suit, Ben, and she signed over the remaining equity in the cars to settle the civil debt. She's moving to a small apartment in Mesa. She's working as a waitress." I took a deep breath. "Good," I said. "I hope she learns how to earn a tip. It might be the first honest money she's ever touched." I hung up and looked at my suitcase. It was time to go again. Not to escape, but to connect. I was going to Chicago. I was going to see my nephews. I was going to be a person again. As I drove to the airport, I passed one of my dealerships. The sign was bright, the cars were gleaming, and the lot was busy. I felt a sense of pride, but it was distant. That was my work, but it wasn't my life. My life was ahead of me in the people I chose to love and the places I chose to see. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the terminal. I didn't look back. I was Ben West, and for the first time in 62 years, I knew exactly who that was. The flight was on time, the sky was clear, and the world was wide open. Chicago in November was a sharp, cold slap after the lingering heat of Phoenix. The wind came off the lake like a jagged blade cutting through my wool coat, but I didn't mind. The chill felt honest. It was a physical reminder that I was somewhere new, somewhere that didn't hold the ghosts of my mistakes. My sister Sarah met me at O'Hare, and for the first time in a decade, the hug didn't feel forced. She didn't ask me for a loan. She didn't complain about her husband. She just held on tight and said, "It's good to have you back, Ben." I spent 2 weeks in her guest room, a space that smelled of lavender and old books. I played board games with my nephews, boys who saw me not as a millionaire, but as the guy who was surprisingly good at Monopoly. We walked through the city, the gray slush of the sidewalks a stark contrast to the red rocks of Sedona. I felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership. I wasn't the boss here, I was just Uncle Ben. It was a quiet, steady kind of joy that I had forgotten existed. But even in the peace of the Midwest, the final echoes of the Phoenix explosion were still ringing. One evening, while Sarah was making dinner, a thick manila envelope arrived via FedEx. It was from the prosecutor's office in Arizona. I took it to the kitchen table, my hands steady as I broke the seal. Inside were the final transcripts from Melvin's sentencing hearing and a victim impact statement from the state. But there was something else. A letter, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, with a return address from the state penitentiary. I stared at the scrawled handwriting. It was from Melvin. I felt a momentary surge of the old anger, but it was quickly replaced by a weary curiosity. I opened the letter. It wasn't an apology. It was a frantic, desperate rant. Melvin claimed that Joseph, the guide in Tanzania, was threatening his family. He claimed that the $8,000 kill fee hadn't been fully paid because I had returned early, and now Joseph's associates in the States were looking for the balance. He begged me to pay them off for Francis's sake. He even included a phone number and a name, the Jaguar. I read it twice, then started to laugh. The audacity of the man was breathtaking. Even from a prison cell, he was trying to run a scam, using my own fear to squeeze one last check out of me. I showed the letter to Sarah. She read it, her face tightening with disgust. "What are you going to do, Ben?" she asked. "Is it real? Is Francis in danger?" I looked at the letter, then at the Jaguar contact info. "It's a lie, Sarah," I said. "It's the same play he's been making for 8 years. He creates a crisis, paints himself as the victim, and waits for me to fix it with my checkbook. He probably made up the Jaguar after watching a movie in the prison lounge." I took the letter to the fireplace and dropped it onto the embers. We watched it curl into black ash. But the mention of Francis stayed with me. I called Holloway the next morning. "Is there any truth to this?" I asked, recounting the letter. Holloway sighed. "Ben, Francis is living in a studio in Mesa. She's working double shifts at a diner. She has a restraining order against Melvin and hasn't spoken to him since the sentencing. There are no associates. Melvin is just trying to find a way to get money into his commissary account or to feel like he still has a leash on you. The only danger Francis is in is the danger of having to pay her own rent." I felt a strange sense of relief, not because Francis was safe, but because the drama was finally truly over. There were no more secrets, no more hidden plots, just the messy, mundane reality of two people who had destroyed their own lives. "Let her be, Holloway," I said. "Don't tell her about the letter. Don't tell her about me. Let her live the life she's built." I hung up and went for a walk. The Chicago wind was howling, but I felt warm. I was no longer a character in their movie. I had walked off the set and into the real world. My last night in Chicago, Sarah and I sat on her back porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the snow start to fall. "What's next, Ben?" she asked. "Are you going back to Phoenix?" I looked at the white flakes disappearing into the dark. "For a little while," I said. "To finish the sale of the dealerships. I'm thinking of moving to a mountain town in Colorado, somewhere I can hike in the summer and sit by a fire in the winter, somewhere quiet." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "You've spent your whole life building things for other people, Ben. It's time you built something for yourself." I flew back to Arizona the next day. I spent a month wrapping up the business. I sold the dealerships to Dave, my floor manager, on a long-term buyout that ensured the staff would be taken care of and that I would have a steady, modest income for the rest of my life. I didn't need the millions. I just needed enough. I moved out of the condo and into a small cabin outside of Durango. It was a simple place, 1 bedroom, a big kitchen, and a deck that looked out over the San Juan Mountains. It was the opposite of my Scottsdale mansion. It was perfect. I spent my days hiking, reading, and learning to play the guitar. I made friends with the local shopkeepers, people who knew me as the guy from the cabin rather than the car mogul. I felt a sense of contentment that was deeper than anything I'd ever known. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't checking my bank balance every hour. I was just living. My phone rarely buzzed with anything more urgent than a weather alert or a text from Sarah with pictures of the boys. The noise had finally completely stopped. One afternoon, about a year after I moved, I was sitting on my deck when a car pulled into the gravel driveway. It was an old beat-up sedan, the kind I used to see on the wholesale lot and send straight to the scrapper. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired, her face lined with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was Francis. I felt a momentary jolt of the old panic, the old provider instinct, but I pushed it down. I stood up, my hands resting on the railing. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't move toward me. She stayed by the car, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'm not here for money. I swear. I needed to see you. I needed to say it, in person, without a lawyer or a judge." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I'm sorry," she said, And for the first time in my life, I believed her. There was no theatrical sob, no manipulation, just a quiet, hollowed-out admission of guilt. I know I can't fix it. I know I don't deserve a place in your life. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying, I'm working, I'm sober, I'm human again. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't the little girl with the dandelions, and she wasn't the monster who sent me to Africa. She was just a woman who had made a terrible choice and was now living with the consequences. I'm glad to hear that, Frances, I said, my voice quiet. I truly am. She nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. I'll go now, she said. I just wanted you to know. She turned back to the car. Frances, I called out. She stopped, her hand on the door handle. Keep going, I said. Don't look back. Just keep going. She gave me a small, sad smile, got in the car, and drove away. I watched the dust settle on the driveway. Then I sat back down and picked up my guitar. The story was over. The music was just beginning. The gravel dust from the car Frances drove settled back into the mountain road, leaving the air thin and quiet once more. I sat on my deck in Colorado, the wood grain under my fingers feeling more real than the millions I used to manage in Scottsdale. The peace was a physical weight, but the visit had stirred the silt at the bottom of my soul. Seeing her without the makeup, without the designer jewelry I had bought her, made the betrayal feel less like a movie and more like a tragedy. She was working double shifts and driving a wreck, and for the first time I didn't reach for my checkbook to fix it. I went inside and made a pot of coffee, the steam rising in the cool mountain morning. The silence was broken 2 days later by a phone call from Dave, the man now running my flagship dealership. His voice was tight, the kind of tone that usually meant a shipment of cars had been lost or a major account was walking. Ben, we have a problem, Dave said. Someone is poking around the old records, specifically the Tanzania wire transfer. They're not from the police and they're not from the bank. They've been asking the junior staff about Joseph. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck, a ghost of the heat I had felt in the African bush. Who are they? I asked, my voice steady as I leaned against the kitchen counter. Dave hesitated. They're private investigators, but the firm is a front for an international group. Ben, I think Joseph didn't just disappear after you left. I think he wants the rest of the money Melvin promised him, and he knows Frances is the only one left on the outside. I looked out the window at the snow-capped peaks. Melvin's prison letter hadn't been a scam. It had been a warning. I called Rick Holloway immediately. He didn't sound surprised. Joseph is a fixer, Ben. People like him don't like being stiffed on a contract, especially one as messy as yours. If Melvin used the dealership reserve fund, he left a trail that leads right back to you and Frances. If Joseph is looking for his balance, he's going to go where the money is. I gripped the phone until my hand throbbed. Frances has nothing, Rick. She's living in a studio in Mesa. Exactly, Holloway replied, which makes her the perfect leverage to get to you. I hung up and sat in the dark. The daughter who had tried to kill me was now the target of the man she had hired to do the job. I could leave it alone. I could let the consequences she had invited finally finish her off. But I thought of the way she had looked in my driveway, the human being I had glimpsed through the wreckage. I grabbed my keys and my heavy coat. I wasn't the bank anymore, but I was still the man who knew how to close a deal. I drove toward the interstate, the tires crunching on the gravel. I wasn't going to save her with a checkbook this time. I was going to finish the war she had started. The miles blurred as I headed south, back toward the heat and the ghosts of Arizona. I reached Mesa by dawn, the sky a bruised purple over the strip malls and the sagging palm trees. I found her apartment complex, a place with bars on the windows and the smell of old grease in the air. I sat in my car and watched the front entrance. At 6:30 she walked out, wearing her waitress uniform, her eyes fixed on the ground. A dark SUV was parked at the end of the block, the engine idling. The SUV started to move, creeping along the curb behind her. I didn't think. I shifted into gear and pulled out, blocking the SUV's path. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires hissing on the hot asphalt. I stepped out of my car, the Phoenix heat hitting me like a physical memory. The SUV door opened, and a man in khaki safari gear stepped out, his eyes scanning the street just like they had at Kilimanjaro Airport. "Joseph," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet morning. The guide froze, his hand disappearing into his jacket. I didn't move. The SUV window rolled down, and a second man pointed a camera at me. "This isn't Africa, Joseph," I said, stepping toward him. "There are no buffalo here, and I'm not the man who stepped off that plane." Joseph's hand stayed inside his jacket, his eyes darting toward Frances, who was now frozen on the sidewalk 20 yards away. "Dad," she whispered, her voice lost in the hum of a distant siren. I didn't look at her. I kept my focus on Joseph, the man who had stalked me through the golden grass of Tanzania. The silence was a taut wire between us, ready to snap. "You were supposed to be a ghost, Mr. West," Joseph said, his voice lower and more dangerous than I remembered. "Your son-in-law still owes me $12,000, Joseph continued, stepping closer. "He promised me the world, but he gave me a jail cell and a broken contract. I don't leave business unfinished." I looked at the dark SUV, then back at him. "The money is gone, Joseph. Melvin is in a jumpsuit and the dealerships are sold. There's no pot of gold at the end of this rainbow." Joseph smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold calculation of a predator. "You have money, Ben. You have the cabin in the mountains and the accounts Holloway is hiding. If the daughter pays the price, the father usually finds the funds." I felt the old protective instinct flare up, but I channeled it into a cold, hard clarity. "You're a long way from home for a debt you can't collect," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I pressed play. Joseph's own voice filled the street, the recording I had made behind the equipment shed in Tanzania. "It's not working naturally. I can't just push him in." Joseph's face drained of color, his professional mask cracking just like it had when I told him I was leaving the safari early. "I have 3 copies of this, Joseph. One is with Rick Holloway, one is with the Scottsdale police, and the third is in a vault you'll never find. If anything happens to me or my daughter, those recordings go to the FBI. You won't just be out of money, you'll be in a cell next to Melvin." I stepped forward until I was inches from his face. The second man in the SUV looked at Joseph, waiting for a signal. Joseph's jaw locked, his eyes burning with a frustrated rage. He knew he had been outplayed again. The businessman had won the war the guide had tried to start. "This contract is dead," I said, my voice a low growl. "Get in your car and go back to the airport. If I see this SUV again, the recording goes live." Joseph didn't speak. He turned and climbed back into the passenger seat, his movements sharp and angry. The SUV roared to life, the tires screaming as it pulled a jagged U-turn and disappeared toward the interstate. I stood in the middle of the street, the morning sun finally cresting the horizon, hot and unforgiving. I turned toward Frances. She was shaking, her back against the brick wall of her apartment building. "Dad," she choked out, her face a mask of terror and confusion. I walked to my car and opened the door. "You're safe, Frances. Joseph won't be coming back." I didn't move toward her to offer a hug. I didn't reach for my wallet. The debt was paid, but the bridge was still out. I got into the car and started the engine. "I have to go," I said through the open window. "I have a life in the mountains to get back to." She nodded, a single sob breaking through her silence. "Thank you," she whispered. I shifted into gear and drove away, watching her figure shrink in the rearview mirror until she was just a speck against the gray concrete of Mesa. I drove north, the desert giving way to the pines of Flagstaff and then the red rocks of the border. The air grew cooler with every mile, the weight on my chest finally starting to dissolve. I had defended what was mine, and I had done it without becoming the monster they thought I was. I crossed back into Colorado as the stars began to poke through the twilight. I pulled into my gravel driveway and killed the lights. The cabin was dark, peaceful, and exactly where I belonged. I sat on my deck for a long time, listening to the wind in the trees. The world was big and dangerous and full of people who wanted what they hadn't earned. But I was 63 years old, and I finally knew how to keep the gate closed. The winter in Durango came on fast and hard, the first heavy snow burying the deck in 2 feet of white powder. I spent my days chopping wood, the physical rhythm of the axe, a meditation that cleared the last of the phoenix smog from my lungs. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, mostly silent except for the weekly check-ins from Sarah. The world I had built for 40 years was a distant memory, a story about a man who had more money than peace. I was learning to live with less and finding that it gave me more. The news from the outside arrived in late January. Rick Holloway sent a final packet of documents. Melvin's appeal had been denied, and he was being moved to a more permanent facility. Frances had moved again, this time to a small town in northern Arizona where she was working in a community garden. She hadn't reached out. She was keeping her promise to keep going, and I was keeping mine to let her. I sat by the fire, the orange light dancing on the walls of the cabin. I had survived the crocodiles, the buffalo, and the people who shared my blood but not my heart. I was an old man, and I was alone. But I wasn't lonely. I had my books, my guitar, and the quiet satisfaction of a life that was finally in balance. I looked at the old photo of Frances at 10, the one I had kept through all the moves. I didn't see the little girl anymore. I saw the person she had been and the person she was trying to become. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a process, a slow erosion of anger by the steady flow of time. I wasn't there yet, but I was on the path. I picked up my guitar and played a few chords, the music filling the small room and drifting out into the cold, starlit night. The next morning, I walked out onto the deck to clear the new snow. The air was so cold it stung my lungs, but it felt clean. I looked out over the valley, the world a vast shimmering blanket of white. I saw a hawk circling high above, a lonely silhouette against the pale blue sky. It was free, and so was I. The story was over, the battles were won, and the silence was no longer a burden. I went back inside and poured a cup of coffee, the smell of roasted beans a simple, perfect pleasure. I sat at the window and watched the sun rise, the golden light turning the snow into a field of diamonds. I thought of the future, not as a series of targets and deals, but as a collection of quiet mornings and long walks. I was Ben West, and I was finally home. The final resolution of the estate came in the spring, when the last of the dealership buyout funds were diverted into the Dignity Foundation. Rick Holloway called to tell me the paperwork was filed. The $4,500,000 was officially working to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. My legacy wasn't a name on a building or a fleet of cars. It was a shield for the vulnerable. I felt a deep, quiet sense of justice, a restoration of the order I had worked so hard to maintain. I spent the summer traveling through the national parks, my old car carrying me from the red canyons of Utah to the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest. I slept in tents, ate meals over campfires, and talked to strangers about nothing in particular. I was just another traveler, a gray-haired man with a camera and a quiet smile. I didn't tell them my name, and they didn't ask. I was enjoying the anonymity I had earned. When I returned to the cabin in August, there was a small package waiting on the porch. It was a simple wooden box hand-carved with a note inside. It was from Frances. No money, no requests, just a photo of a small garden plot and a sprig of dried lavender. "I grew this," the note said. "I thought you might like the smell. It reminds me of the house." I held the lavender to my nose and closed my eyes. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. I felt the scent of a new beginning. I placed the box on my mantle, next to the photo of the little girl with the soccer ball. They were two different people, but they both belonged to me. I went out onto the deck and watched the sun set over the San Juans, the sky a riot of pink and orange. I took a deep breath, the mountain air filling my chest with a peace that was finally permanent. I was 64 years old, and I had seen the worst of people and the best of the world. I had survived the crocodiles and the greed, and I had come out on the other side with my dignity intact. My life was my own, my house was my own, and my heart was finally, truly still. I went inside, picked up my guitar, and played a simple, steady melody into the deepening dark. The story was finished, and the life was good. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.